My name is Thomas Grady. I'm 58 years old and I've lived my entire life in Des Moines, Iowa. I've worked in the same beige office building for the last 27 of those years. Same corridor, same coffee machine, same creaky elevator that hums like it's trying to remember its purpose. The world doesn't look twice at people like me, middle-aged, quiet, heavyset, careful with my words. There's nothing flashy about me, no voice that commands a room, no presence that turns heads, just a steady, measured rhythm of getting things done. But people remember my face, or more precisely, they remember the skin. Vitiligo isn't something you can cover with confidence. It spreads like a slow echo across your body, draining pigment, leaving behind shapes that feel like they don't belong to you. Mine started near the left ear in my late 30s, a pale bloom that widened across my cheekbone over time, moved down to the neck, and scattered across my hands. People say they don't notice it after a while, but they do. They always do. They just get quieter about it. My office is on the 3rd floor, not management, not low tier. Somewhere in the quiet middle, where the work is invisible but essential. That's where I've lived for years. Invisible but essential. And then there was Dan. Dan had the corner office. Floor-to-ceiling glass, imported chair, ego that barely fit behind his desk. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way. That would have made it easier to name. He was charming, loud, the kind of man who could insult you in front of 10 people and make them laugh along with him before they realized what had happened. He was younger than me by 15 years, and he never let me forget it. His jokes were small at first. A comment in the elevator, a look during presentations, then they grew teeth, a remark about my skin in the middle of a team meeting. Laughter, nervous chuckles around the table. No one said anything. Neither did I. You learn, after a certain age, to survive humiliation by absorbing it. You let it pass through you like a cold wind. You don't react. You don't show anger. You just stay. Keep doing your job. Because you know that rage only feeds men like Dan. And because dignity, once lost in front of others, doesn't return the same way. That day, the joke wasn't clever. It wasn't new. He made a crack about blending in with the office walls. Something about my spots looking like someone forgot to finish painting me. I don't remember the words exactly. I stopped cataloging them long ago. But I remember the sound. The sharp, dry burst of his laugh, the brief pause in the room, the kind of silence that sucks the air out of everyone's lungs for half a second. That was the moment something shifted. Not in him, in the room. It was like someone had clapped, not literally, but that same effect, sudden stillness that echoes. A few people looked down. One of the junior analysts adjusted his chair too, fast. A coffee stirrer dropped to the floor. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at Dan. I just looked straight ahead at the screen. A spreadsheet, quarterly numbers. My hand stayed on the keyboard. My breathing stayed even. The room moved on, but the air didn't. That was the first time I noticed they weren't really laughing anymore. Not fully. Not the way they used to. It wasn't just awkwardness. It was something else. Fatigue, maybe. Embarrassment. Not for me. For him. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't enjoy it. That's not how it works. You don't get moments of justice. You get flickers, thin, quiet cracks in the pattern. And you wait. You wait to see if they grow. Dan didn't notice. Of course he didn't. People like him are blind to anything that isn't a mirror. He kept talking, kept grinning, kept leading the meeting like nothing had shifted. But I saw it. I felt it. And I knew, for the first time in years, that the room was listening to something other than him. That night, I walked home slower than usual. Same streets, same lights, but something in my posture had changed. Not pride, something colder. Heaviness, maybe. Like the weight of being watched had finally settled into my bones. Not as shame, but as confirmation. They saw me. Finally. Not in the way he wanted. not as a punchline, but as something that didn't break. The thing about being mocked enough times is that your body begins to anticipate it, like a reflex, like bracing for a gust of wind that never really stops blowing. You start to move differently, sit differently, even breathe differently, always calculating how visible you are, how long someone's gaze lingers, where the nearest exit is. For years I had mastered the art of subtle disappearance, keeping to the edges of every room, lowering my head slightly when walking past glass, not to hide my skin entirely, that was impossible, but to at least soften the edge of the stare. But after that last meeting, something changed in how they looked at me. Not kinder, not crueler, just longer. As if they had suddenly remembered I was human. As if the familiarity of the joke had collapsed, and now they were left with nothing but the weight of their own silence. It was strange, being seen, not through. The lens of laughter not as contrast to Dan's charm, but fully, quietly, uncomfortably. The next morning I stood a little straighter. It wasn't a choice. My body just refused to shrink the way it used to. I walked into the office earlier than usual, the floor still half empty. The lights hummed overhead, too bright, too sterile. My reflection flickered in the glass door of the meeting room. For a moment I stood there looking at it, at the scatter of pale skin across my jaw and neck, at the folds near my mouth, at the lines around my eyes that had deepened over years of unspoken restraint. My face wasn't neutral. It told a story, one people usually looked away from. But that day I didn't. I watched it, watched myself, and didn't flinch. By noon the office had filled, and so had the noise. Dan arrived late as usual, laughing too loud in the hallway, making a comment about the vending machine being racist for not taking his dollar. People chuckled, but not as quickly. There was a pause now, a delay, like their reaction had, to pass through something heavier. That pause grew in the days that followed. Like a crack in a dam you could feel widening, even if no one pointed it out. I didn't talk more. I didn't push. I just did what I'd always done. Reviewed numbers, checked reports, cleaned up others' mistakes before they reached upper management. I corrected Dan's projections quietly, sent revised spreadsheets without calling attention to them. I stayed late when no one asked, came in early without a badge scan. I was already running half of what he was supposed to be in charge of. No one said it aloud, but they saw it, he saw it too. Not immediately, but eventually. It started in the way he looked at me during meetings. Less smug, more measured. He would glance at me quickly like someone checking the mirror after a lie. And then came the deflection. Jokes more often, louder, messier. The kind of humor that doesn't land but dares people to say it didn't. People laughed, but now it was out of habit, not instinct. He tried to pull me in one day, some nonsense, about me being his longest-running assistant. It wasn't the first time he'd called me that. But this time no one laughed. The room stayed quiet just a little too long. He covered it up with a comment about my skin again. Something about coffee creamer and camouflage. A few people forced out noises. One person looked down. I looked at him. Fully. Directly. I didn't speak. Just met his eyes and held them there. For the first time, he looked away. That night I didn't go straight home. I sat in the parking lot watching the lights in the building turn off one by one. It's strange what loneliness does when it's interrupted. For years I had lived beneath the surface of things, never invited in but always present. Now I felt myself surfacing, not because anyone had reached out a hand, but because the water had started to part. The following week, he botched a report, badly. Missed 3 major errors, one of which nearly triggered a call from corporate. I fixed it before it spread. Quietly. As always. No credit, no announcement. But the director copied me on the next thread. CC'd me directly. Small things. Barely noticeable. Unless you were watching closely. Dan noticed. He began staying later. Speaking faster. Calling more meetings. Shifting blame with more desperation. And the louder he got, the more the team leaned. back into themselves, watching, waiting, measuring. I didn't have to say a word, I just kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept letting them see the difference between noise and value. I've always believed that time reveals everything. In the end, you don't have to tear anyone down. You just have to endure, long enough for the walls to fall on their own. And now, the cracks in his started showing. He still joked, still smiled. But his eyes had changed. Not confident, not mocking, searching. And he was starting to realize no one was laughing anymore. Dan's office was at the end of the hallway, past the glass doors, past the print station, past everything that felt functional. His door always stayed open just enough to suggest importance but not invitation. I walked past it dozens of times, a day, never looking in, never slowing down. But I saw everything. The wall behind his desk was filled with framed certificates, leadership awards, and letters of recognition from initiatives he had barely touched. I knew because I was the one who followed up when those initiatives stalled. I was the one who made sure the graphs aligned, the projections hit target, the report sounded smarter than the raw numbers beneath them. He had mastered the language of success. I had mastered the structure beneath it. There was a moment, about 2 weeks after the last team meeting, when I passed his door and saw him staring at one of those frames, just standing there, hands in his pockets, still. I kept walking, didn't break stride, but I caught the tension in his back, the way his shoulders curved just slightly inward, like something inside him was sinking. That was the week another project landed in my inbox, not delegated, not handed off, but routed directly. A new account, sensitive, complex, one Dan had promised he'd lead personally. The email came from upstairs, no explanation. Just my name copied cleanly on the header. I didn't gloat. I didn't even pause. I opened the file and got to work. I didn't mention it to anyone. But when Dan walked past my desk the next morning and saw the screen, his eyes narrowed. His smile faltered, then returned. Too fast, too wide. He made some passing remark about multitasking. I said nothing, just kept typing. The silence between us stretched, not tense, ironic. People started stopping by my desk more often, asking questions, clarifying numbers, checking timelines. Not because I invited them, because they trusted me to know. There's a difference. One of the newer hires, a quiet woman who rarely spoke above a murmur, left a note on my desk that read simply, "Thank you for explaining things clearly." No one had ever thanked me on paper. I kept the note folded in my drawer, not as a token, as proof. Dan started coming in earlier, leaving later. The smell of burnt coffee lingered longer in the kitchenette. He held meetings for projects that didn't need them, sent out team-wide emails that read like declarations. But people stopped responding with the same speed. They waited, watched, and when no one replied, the silence felt colder. He was crumbling, in inches, not dramatically, just enough that the sheen began to dull. The leadership wall behind his desk stayed the same, but now when I walked past it, I didn't look away. I looked straight through it, because I knew what those frames covered, the gaps, the shortcuts, the names left off the credits. At the quarterly performance review, my name came up twice in front of the board, once for consistency, once for clarity, no flash, no applause, just acknowledgement. And that, for someone like me, felt louder than any award. Dan heard it. He was sitting 3 chairs away, nodding like he approved, like he was part of the reason. But his hands tapped the table too often. His voice, when he spoke next, cracked slightly. He shifted topics mid-sentence. It didn't go unnoticed. By then his allies in the office had grown quiet. The ones who used to echo his jokes now offered small nods when they passed me. Subtle gestures, shifting tides. I didn't need a parade. I needed stability. And now, for the first time in years, the ground beneath me felt solid. One night I stayed late to finish a report. The office was nearly dark. I walked past Dan's office and found the door wide open. He wasn't there. The lights were off. But I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the wall. The frames were still there, polished, symmetrical, proud. But they meant nothing to me now, because I knew that behind those glass fronts was hollow space. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. I turned back to my desk, sat down, and kept working. Not to prove anything, but because the work still mattered, because even as the foundation cracked around him, mine only grew steadier. They say power changes people, but it doesn't. It reveals what was already there. He had the wall, I had the weight behind it, and in the end, weight always outlasts polish. It was a Thursday morning, the kind that begins without distinction. Gray light, stale air in the elevator, the scent of microwaved leftovers from someone who arrived too early. I followed the same path as always, past reception, nodding, once at the security guard, past the framed motivational posters lining the hallway, past Dan's office. But this time, something was off. His door was closed. Not slightly ajar, not swinging with the draft, shut, lights off. I paused only for a fraction of a second, then kept walking. People are allowed to be late. But Dan wasn't the type to be late without making sure everyone knew why. He wore punctuality like a badge when it served him, used it like a weapon when it didn't. By 10 o'clock, the whispers had started. The junior associate 2 desks from mine mentioned his calendar was blank. A manager said his phone went to voicemail. Meetings that were supposed to involve him quietly shifted focus, realigned without acknowledgement. I continued working, reviewed 2 reports, cleared out flagged accounts, signed off on 3 overdue proposals he had delayed for weeks. No one officially said it, but his absence was now shaping the air. It wasn't just physical, it was structural. He was a piece that had held weight, not because he carried it, but because so much was stacked around him. And now, with that piece missing, everything tilted slightly, revealing what had been leaning without support all along. By noon, HR had sent an email. Polite, brief. Language sterilized for circulation. Mr. Mallory will be out of office for an indefinite period. No reason given. No return date listed, just out. It landed in my inbox with the same sound as any other message, but I read it 3 times. Not because I was surprised, because it confirmed what I'd already felt in the marrow of the morning. He wasn't just late. He was gone. The office didn't react all at once. Some people acted as if it hadn't happened. Others whispered like it had happened before. I noticed the difference in behavior more than words. Chairs turned toward me, more frequently. Eyes lingered longer at my desk during calls. Questions were phrased more carefully, as though people were unsure where the chain of command now ended. I didn't answer what wasn't asked. I just continued. Signed documents, verified numbers, aligned targets. I didn't step into his role. I absorbed the space he left. That evening, as I prepared to leave, a soft chime on my screen interrupted. The quiet, a calendar invite. From HR. Meeting scheduled for the following morning. No subject line, no agenda. Just my name in the header and a time, 9:30. I stared at it for a full minute. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't sweat. There was no adrenaline. Just a slow, steady pressure behind the ribs, like something moving into place. I didn't sleep much that night, but not out of fear. There was nothing left to fear. I had already been under his shadow, already been the target of laughter, the background figure with the strange face and the steady hands. I had already endured everything he had to offer. What remained was nothing but a hallway I had walked for decades and a door that no longer intimidated me. The next morning I arrived early, sat at my desk, cleared emails, reviewed a client file. I wasn't rehearsing. I wasn't preparing a pitch. I wasn't looking for a script to follow. I was just ready. At 9:28, I stood up and walked down the hallway, the same hallway where his voice used to echo, where his jokes used to land, where his footsteps used to signal authority. Now the floor felt quiet beneath mine. I passed the glass. Offices. No one called out. No one stopped me. The door to HR was already open. Inside, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The words were simple. They explained that Dan had stepped down. Personal reasons. No scandal. No sudden collapse. Just a quiet unraveling. The kind that happens when performance finally outruns substance. And they said, my name with a tone that felt like something being set down, not lifted up. As if the decision had already lived in the space, waiting only for the air to clear. I didn't ask questions. I didn't smile. I didn't pretend to be surprised. Just nodded. My voice when it came was low even. I accepted. When I left the office, I didn't walk past his door. I walked into it. For the first time. It still smelled like him. Cologne, coffee, faint anxiety. The wall of awards was still there. But I didn't look at them. I looked at the desk. At the chair. At the window behind it. And I sat down. The view hadn't changed, but the weight of the seat was different. Not heavier, just real. Something earned, not claimed. Outside, the hallway stayed quiet, and this time, the silence belonged to me. The first morning in the new office felt unfamiliar, not because of the space itself, but because of how quietly it accepted me. The air was still. The chair creaked differently when I sat in it, lower to the ground than I remembered. The blinds were already half drawn, letting in a line of pale gold across the desk like a spotlight angled from some indifferent sky. I didn't move to open them wider. I liked the way the light cut through, slanted and imperfect. It didn't try to fill the room. It simply marked the space. Nothing had been rearranged. His nameplate was gone, replaced with mine. The same black and silver. Block, same font, same size, but different weight. His coffee mug had disappeared, and the faint smell of whatever aftershave he used had begun to fade from the air. What remained was the neutral hum of the building, the kind of background noise I'd lived beneath for years. Only now it surrounded me, not above me. The first emails came in before 9. Congratulations. Short. Clean. From people I had worked beside for years. Most of them never asked me about the skin on my face, never asked how long I'd been doing work that went under someone else's name. They didn't ask now either. They just sent acknowledgments. Some messages were oddly formal, others hesitant, as if they weren't sure how to address me in this new role, or maybe weren't sure how I would respond. I didn't respond to any of them right away. I read them all once, then closed the tab. There was work to do. The day moved faster than I expected. People knocked softly, leaned in, asked questions they used to take to Dan without thinking. I answered them plainly without commentary or flourish. No performance, just clarity, and it was enough. One of the junior staffers looked almost surprised when I explained a financial breakdown she had struggled with for weeks. She nodded once, then backed out of the room like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to linger. The funny thing was, I hadn't changed. Not in the way people assumed. I still spoke the same way. Still moved with the same patience. Still kept my voice low and my focus sharp. But the room around me responded differently now. Not because I had grown louder, but because the noise that used to drown me out was gone. At noon, I stood up and walked toward the window. I hadn't looked out of it since I took the chair. Dan used to keep the blinds halfway closed, always citing the glare on his monitor. But the light today wasn't glaring. It was soft, almost filtered, like the kind that lands between storms. I opened the blinds fully. The city stretched below, gray rooftops, scattered trees, the slow crawl of traffic down the avenue. Nothing dramatic, just life moving forward. In the reflection on the glass, I saw my own face. Faint, ghosted over the buildings. The vitiligo. Across my cheek caught the light and turned pale gold. For a moment it didn't look like something missing, it looked lit from within. I didn't turn away. I didn't adjust my collar. I just stood there and looked back. The reflection didn't flinch, and neither did I. In the afternoon, I found a folder tucked in the back of a drawer labeled Pending. Inside were 3 Proposals Dan had held back. None of them urgent, all of them promising. I reviewed them carefully, made notes, set meetings to revisit them with the team. There was no need to mention they had been buried. People would understand. The office had a memory. It didn't speak, but it remembered who did the work, who took credit, who stayed late, and now it remembered that I was here. As the day ended, the hallway outside quieted again. People trickled out. Lights dimmed. I stayed behind for a while. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel what the room was like when it belonged only to me. I turned off the monitor, leaned back in the chair, and let the last of the daylight reach across the carpet. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt balanced, like something that had been tilted for years had finally settled. I didn't think about Dan. Not really. Not in anger. He had shaped the space with noise, with speed, with performance. I would shape it with stillness, with presence. I would let the work speak, let the room breathe, let the light fall where it wanted. The next morning, the first person who walked in paused at the doorway. She looked around, then smiled, soft and brief, as if noticing the room was the same, but everything felt different. Same walls, same window, same desk. But now it was mine. Weeks passed and the rhythm of the office settled around me like dust on quiet furniture. No announcements had been made beyond the necessary emails, no speeches, no celebrations. That was fine by me. The people who needed to know already did. The people who didn't would find out naturally by the way things moved now, by who they looked to when something slipped out of line. The title on my email signature had changed. The nameplate was permanent. The tone in meetings was different, not because I demanded it, but because the room had changed shape around me. There was less noise, fewer distractions, fewer nervous glances trying to guess whether a joke was coming. My door stayed open, but not performatively. People came in with purpose now, short conversations, direct questions, respect that didn't arrive with flattery, just efficiency. A few colleagues, ones who had once laughed along with Dan, grew noticeably quieter around me. Not uncomfortable, not fearful, just aware. They didn't joke anymore. They nodded more often, kept their comments brief. Sometimes I saw it in their eyes, a small flicker of something unspoken. Maybe guilt, maybe reflection. I didn't chase it. I didn't need their confessions. I wasn't here to collect apologies. Saw Dan again for the first time on a Thursday afternoon, 3 floors down outside the building near the parking garage. He didn't notice me at first. He stood near the vending machine, scrolling through his phone with the posture of someone trying not to be seen. No crowd around him, no volume. Just a man on the edge of something smaller. His suit was still pressed, his shoes polished, but the shine in his eyes was gone. When he finally did glance up, our eyes met. Only for a second. No words. He looked down almost immediately, as if trying to remember what it meant to look directly at someone without turning them into a joke. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He walked away slowly, like someone trying not to limp. I stood there a moment longer. Not to watch him, not out of curiosity, but to measure what was left in me. There was no pride, no bitterness, only stillness. The kind that comes when something has finally settled into the place it always belonged. I didn't feel taller. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt whole. That weekend, I cleaned out the drawers in my new office, not out of necessity, but out of ritual. Among old files and unused pens, I found a list. It was handwritten, Dan's neat cursive in ink fading at the edges, a to-do list. At the top, team development, Grady, circled twice. I stared at it longer than I meant to, not because of the question mark, because of the circle. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever seen from him. A suggestion maybe that he had known, that he had seen what everyone else had started to recognize too late. I tore the page in half and dropped it into the bin, not from anger, just closure. The following Monday I arrived early again. The sky was still dark, but the lights in the building had already begun to blink on. I walked the halls slowly, deliberately, feeling each step like it had weight again. The building no longer loomed over me. It stood with me. The air didn't press against my skin like it used to. I could breathe fully here now. I passed a group near the elevator, new hires I hadn't met yet. One of them whispered something, eyes tracking the shape of the vitiligo across my face. I didn't lower my gaze. I didn't tighten my jaw. I looked directly at him, steady and unflinching. He blinked, looked away, not with disgust, just uncertainty, the kind that lives in people who've never had to confront what dignity looks like when it comes wrapped in silence. As I stepped into my office, the morning light spilled across the wall in streaks. I left the blinds open, sat down, opened my laptop, began again. Somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing the skin first. Not because it changed, but because I no longer shrank beneath it. They adjusted their gaze to follow my presence, not my pigment. It didn't make the vitiligo disappear. It made it irrelevant. They still talk about Dan sometimes, in passing. Like you mention an old logo or a software you don't use anymore. Something that once felt central, now replaced by something quieter but more precise. No one asks where he went. They just remember the difference. I still carry the face they once laughed at. I carry it openly, not as armor, not as a statement, just as mine. And now, when people look at me, they don't search for a punchline. They search for direction.